All right, welcome everybody to the second virtual presentation sponsored by the Sinclair Lewis Society. I'm Sally Perry. I'm the executive director of the Sinclair Lewis Society. And it's my pleasure to welcome today my friend and colleague in Sinclair Lewis for like 30 years now, George Killough, who's a emeritus professor, and he was chair of the college in English at the College of St. Scholastica. He's published a lot on Lewis, especially the Minnesota Diaries of Sinclair Lewis from the 1940s. And a little known fact, although if you tuned in early, you know that George is also a medievalist. And so his retirement is being spent kind of torn between Sinclair Lewis and Chaucer. So, so without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to George to spend a pleasant afternoon talking about Sinclair Lewis.
Am I on here?
Yep.
Okay, I see you on the screen, but anyway, I'll start talking. Good afternoon and welcome to my home in Duluth, Minnesota. At the heart of Sinclair Lewis, in both his books and character, is a struggle between hard facts and romantic dreams, between, on the one hand, an awareness of the world's failures, and on the other hand, an openness to wonder, between the real and the ideal. I think Lewis experienced this struggle more intensely than other people and more than probably most other writers. Of all the complexities in his nature, I think this one identifies him best. From it, his books arose. Many people have noticed this opposition in him, including Sheldon Grebstein, who made it the theme of his book. And I've been influenced by Grebstein, but I'm not going to take his path. He was more interested than I am in Lewis's character flaws and in identifying or judging the quality of each book. What I will do is focus on the period of the Minnesota experiment, 1942 to 46. This is a good window through which to see the rest of Lewis's career. Along the way, I will deviate a little into background. I will unavoidably mention things that Lewis Society members already know. Although I'm a fan of Lewis's comedy, I'm going to emphasize his serious side instead. And one other last warning, and that is that I find myself recently misspeaking quite a bit. So if I say something like January when I mean June, please somebody correct me and set the record straight and bear with any other lapses. Well, to set the context here, the novel that made Lewis famous, let's see here. Here we go. The novel that made Lewis famous, Main Street, published in 1920, has this conflict showing up as the struggle between Carroll Kennicott and Gopher Prairie, Minnesota, representing Main Street, America, and based on Sauk Center, Minnesota, where Lewis grew up. From Carroll's point of view, this place has, quote, no dignity in it nor any hope of greatness. It was a frontier camp, unquote. And sure enough, Sauk Center, just 8 years before Lewis was born, looks like a frontier camp. Notice how harshly it seems to be exposed to the prairie, just as the book says. By 1902, the year that Lewis graduated from high school, it looks a little better, but it still doesn't have what Carroll, in her most extreme moments, is yearning for. At one place in the book, we read that she wants, quote, remembered mists from tropic isles and Paris nights, unquote. There aren't any Paris nights here. Most people remember Lewis for his exposés of hard facts, not at all for romantic dreams. They remember the spirit-stifling small town in Main Street, the negative side of the small businessman in Babbitt, the hypocritical bombast of the charlatan preacher in Elmer Gantry, or the propensity of Americans to abandon their democratic principles and embrace a demagogue instead in It Can't Happen Here. But Lewis's first major biographer, Mark Schorer, who didn't like him, thought of Lewis as a childish romantic, a, quote, profoundly sentimental man, unquote. And Lewis himself, in an interview in the 1940s, said that he didn't want to be seen as a cynic, but instead as a, quote, moral evangelist preaching to my people, unquote, as if he had not only harsh facts to expose, but also high ideals to promote. The Minnesota experiment, by the way, was Lewis's effort in the 1940s to put down roots in his old home state. He came to Minneapolis in spring 1942, rented a house on Lake Minnetonka outside town, worked there most days on writing Gideon Planish, and on a few days, such as weekends, he had himself driven around the state to look at beautiful scenery and to search for a place to settle. In the fall, he moved into town and taught a course at the University of Minnesota. In the winter, he retreated to New York City. In spring 43, he came back to Minnesota for a few days, but at some point that spring, he was waylaid by a sudden invitation to go to Hollywood to work on a screenplay, so he spent the summer there instead. But in spring 1944, he did return to Minnesota, and by this time, he had decided on Duluth as the place to put down his roots, so here he came.
Hey, George, do you still, you don't have a slideshow anymore, is that intentional?
We're coming back to it.
Oh, okay, okay,
Yeah.
I just want to make sure.
Yeah, I'm going in and out of it here. So he came to Minnesota, and one thing that he found in Minnesota, one of the hard facts that he found here was industrial blight on the waterfront. Here is a photo from 1929. This is downtown Duluth, and this is an area we call Canal Park here because it borders the ship canal through which big boats go from the lake into the bay. This is the area that Lewis found appalling. It had industrial buildings instead of any kind of effort to make it beautiful. By 1949, 3 years after Lewis left town, we still have industrial buildings here and a great big vacant lot. In 1951, the year that Lewis died, a reporter in the local newspaper remembered that Lewis used to go down to Canal Park and rail against the ugliness, wave his lanky arms around, and say this: right here, the hotel should begin. There should be a beautiful driveway beginning here and stretching all around the lakeshore to the eastern edge of the city. Well, by 1966, it hadn't improved much. In fact, there was a junkyard down there then. And in 1980, when I came to town, it was still mainly industrial buildings in Canal Park. However, today, Lewis's dream has come true. Here are the hotels all along here. Oh. And this is Lewis's driveway. We call it the Duluth Lake Walk. And the bike path part of it does stretch all along the lakeshore to the eastern edge of the city, about 6 or 7 miles away. So Lewis's dream came true. However, remember that in the 1940s, there were industrial buildings here, and this was one of the hard facts that he confronted when he got here. One of the dreams that Lewis had in coming to Duluth was that he wanted to have an experience like Thoreau at Walden Pond. All his life, he'd admired the book Walden, and he liked the idea of reducing life to its basic qualities, to living simply and close to nature, like Thoreau in a hut at Walden Pond. So Lewis came to Duluth and moved into this house here. Well, this is not a hut at Walden Pond, is it? It's a mansion overlooking Lake Superior, and in this mansion, Lewis had servants. However, it's an understandable compromise. Lewis was aging, he had health problems, he had a tremor in his hands, he was struggling with alcoholism. He was a public figure in considerable demand around the country. And perhaps most of all, he wanted to work on novels, and he wanted to work on novels that captured something of Midwestern society. So to have contact with Midwestern society, he had to live in a place like this instead of retreating to a cabin up in the North Woods somewhere. There are still indications that he had a Thoreauvian intent. You see this stone wall here, that's original with the property. But this part of it, according to local stories, is something that Lewis had constructed. It blocks the steps up to the front porch because, according to the story, Lewis wanted to keep chance passersby on the sidewalk from interrupting his solitude up there on the porch. He wanted to have solitude like Thoreau. And there are other indications as well. Here's one. Before he knew he was going to Hollywood in spring 1943, a reporter from Time magazine interviewed him and wrote this in the People section. Bolstered by the complete works of Henry David Thoreau, newly bought, novelist Sinclair Lewis abandoned his Manhattan duplex for rustic life in his home state, Minnesota. He told a reporter that a reading of Thoreau would explain all, but admitted, quote, "I don't mean I want to go around in a sheet like Gandhi," unquote. Next fall, he will do some public debating on rusticity, said he. Underneath the joke, I think we see a sincere feeling on Lewis's part of wanting to have something like a Thoreauvian experience. And there are further indications. Here's one here. This is a large tract of land just outside Duluth. In the 1940s, it was the University of Minnesota Northeast Agricultural Experiment Station. Researchers from the Twin Cities would come here to work on grain crops, vegetables, and fruits that would flourish in this northern climate. Lewis made an arrangement with the superintendent of this place to be allowed to come out here and walk the lanes undisturbed. I know this because 20 years ago or more, I interviewed the daughter of this man here, Herman Landry, who was the foreman and who lived in a house on the property. And his daughter said that she was a teenager in the 1940s, and she remembered seeing Lewis walking the lanes by himself. Looking back on this, we can say that it was as if Lewis was communing with the quiet of the land, sort of like Thoreau communing with the land around Walden. And like Thoreau, Lewis wanted to keep a record of his connection with nature. Thoreau, after all, chronicled the changing surfaces of Walden Pond. So Lewis kept a diary. And in this diary, he kept track of things like temperature and weather and the look of scenery. This diary may surprise you. Here's an entry, or he typed a diary, so I have a picture of him typing here. I didn't need that, I guess. Here's an entry that may surprise you. This is for D-Day, June 6, 1944. And he starts off mentioning that it is Invasion Day. And then he has a little note on something phony that he heard on the radio. But after a while, he gets into temperatures and weather. And then he says this, 9:30, the moon, invisible last few evenings, is full, with great rippled path of gold over lake. Twigs across face of moon, midnight too high for moon path, high and silver. The whole lake was a calm, radiant plain with yellow lights in Wisconsin, gentle across the water, and lights from a slow gliding ship, the whole tender and inviting. Well, if you're used to what I'll call the hard-boiled voice of satire in a novel like Elmer Gantry, this may surprise you because this has a kind of a quiet tone. It's reflective and lyrical. It's more like what a romantic essayist would say than a hard-boiled novelist. Lewis really loved beautiful views. In fact, he may have chosen his house because of the view. Here's a picture from the back side of his house. This is 26th Avenue East. And from here down to the lake, is a little more than half a mile. If you zoom into the middle of this picture, you can see the lake a little better, but he had an even better view than this because the roof that you see here of the house across the street, that wasn't there in the 1940s. In fact, there was a vacant lot there, and Lewis made sure that he owned that lot so that nobody could build there and ruin his view. He really loved beautiful scenery, like a good romantic. In fact, he kept a record of all the beautiful scenery in Minnesota. He called this, he kept it as a typescript, a single-spaced 19-page typescript that is still in the Yale archive. And in fact, it's in the same loose leaf binder as the Minnesota Diary. Yeah. It has descriptions of fairly matter-of-fact descriptions of places all over Minnesota. Here is an entry for Duluth. I'm going to just point to two things here. Skyline Drive, he called it Parkway, but it's really Drive. It's a road that goes along the ridge over the city and looks down on the lake. And then Grandview Golf Links here. And I'm going to show you some of these views, starting with Grandview Golf Links. When you come up from the Twin Cities to Duluth, you approach it from the west. And so you would come by Grandview Golf Links first before you get to Duluth. Here's a superhighway here that wasn't there in Lewis's time. Here we are high on a hill in Grandview Golf Links, and you see how far away the horizon is. That's many, many miles. Then as you go east, you get onto Skyline Drive right here. This is Skyline Drive, and you can look down on the St. Louis River and see this beautiful site here. The St. Louis River feeds the bay from the west, although the water is coming down from points north in Minnesota, but it approaches the bay here from the west. And here the river has expanded quite a bit, so there's room for all these lovely islands. If you go further to the east, you come to an overlook that's just off Skyline Drive, where you can see some of the working part of the harbor. This is Superior, Wisconsin over here, and this is Minnesota Point that separates the lake from the bay. And if you point the camera a little more toward the northeast from this same site, you can see the north shore of Lake Superior over here stretching way off into the distance. Duluth's downtown is in this area right in here, obscured a little bit by the hill and the trees. And here's the ship canal here. And then if you drive even further east, you can look down on the eastern communities of Duluth and see the lake and Wisconsin across the lake. I show you these scenes just to underline the fact that Lewis, like a romantic, could really appreciate the wonder of nature. He really loved beautiful scenery. When he was a boy, of course, he walked enormous distances and knew nature quite well. And as a middle-aged person, I'm not sure he could walk quite so far, but he did have himself driven around and saw beautiful scenery. Well, like a good romantic, he could find the wonder not only in nature, but also in people. There's a lovely story in the diary about a boat ride on the St. Louis River Bay, or the Superior, Wisconsin, the Duluth Superior Bay in June 1944. It's a long afternoon and evening, and the boat goes way up into the area where those islands are that I showed you a little bit. And the people who take Lewis on the boat ride are 7 upper middle class businessmen, and Lewis finds them really very interesting. He's of course entranced by the scenery, but he's equally entranced by the men. They are friendly and prosperous. They have sons in the war. They have given generously of time and money to community causes. They like to tell jokes. And here's something Lewis says about them. This is actually in a carbon of a letter to Marcella Powers, but Lewis put carbons of parts of letters to Marcella Powers in many places in his diary as if he considered them diary entries. So here's what he says about the men. These men are halfway between a Babbitt and a Dodsworth. They are upper middle class America, and I think that if one lived among them 10 years, one would like them rather better than all our war correspondents. I think they are peculiar to America, and in Babbitt, I just began to paint them. Well, here's some of the men. This is Fred Buck. He was in the real estate business. Here is Lewis Castle. He was a banker when Sinclair Lewis knew him, although here he's being connected to the St. Lawrence Seaway project. And here is Charles Liscombe, who was in the insurance business. I don't have pictures of the other 4 guys, so I won't tell you their names, but I think the importance of seeing their faces so far, at least 3 faces, is to get a sense that Lewis really could appreciate real live human beings and see the wonder in them. And he wasn't just a hard-boiled novelist who could see cynical things. I think it's really downright marvelous that he was able to acknowledge to himself that he hadn't yet quite captured the unique quality of these men, even though he had by this point written several novels featuring American businessmen. Well, the first book that Lewis worked on in Duluth was Cass Timberlane. It's set in a city exactly like Duluth. Grand Republic, Minnesota, which is 80 miles north of Minneapolis, has a population of 85,000 and an economic base of wood products, iron ore, and wheat. A dream underlies the plot, and the dream is that December-May marriage can succeed. Cass is a middle-aged divorced judge who falls in love with a young woman, marries her, and they're happy for a while, but then she's seduced away by one of Cass's womanizing friends who takes her off to a distant city, neglects her, and then she falls ill. Cass gets wind of this, rushes off to rescue her and brings her home. And the book ends with a very strong sense that this marriage is going to survive, that it's been through the rockiest part that it will ever face, and that these two will live more or less happily ever after. Well, against this dream is a series of stark vignettes sprinkled throughout the book between chapters. Lewis labeled them an assemblage of husbands and wives, this series of vignettes, and they collectively show the sad state of marriage among Lewis's friends and neighbors. A very few of the stories are happy, but the vast majority are unhappy, and they run the gamut from philandering men to scandalous divorcees to people who are bored spouses, intimidated spouses, people so demoralized they want to commit suicide. And yet, remember, the main plot is about the dream that December-May marriage can work. Well, one of the reasons Lewis had this dream, as you probably all know, is this: Marcella Powers. He was still having a romance with her at the time he wrote this book. He met her in 1939 in Provincetown doing summer stock theater. She was assigned to help him learn lines. After a while, they became an item and traveled around the country together. He tried to help her find a career. She tried acting first, then magazine journalism. Eventually, he set her up as a literary agent, and she worked in that capacity for the rest of her working life. During the Duluth years, he tried to persuade her to visit, and she did come to Duluth a couple times, but she had work in New York and didn't stay very long when she was here. Not too long after Lewis left Duluth in 1946, she told him that she was going to marry somebody else, and this broke his heart. He had dedicated books to her, and he left money in his will to her. I think, though, that the reason to dwell on this a little bit is just to underline the fact that this very worldly wise man could somehow still believe that a relationship with this very young woman was sustainable. Well, the next book that Lewis worked on in Duluth was King's Blood Royal, also set in the same city as Cass Timberlane. At the heart of this book is the idea of the American dream. Like in many Lewis books, we have the American dream being thwarted, and it's thwarted in this case by racial hatred. Neil is a white man who discovers a Black ancestor and then tells his friends, and his life falls apart. Ebony magazine gave it an award for being the book that contributed most to racial understanding during the year it was published. And Ebony also ran a photo spread illustrating segments of the plot. So here's Ebony's picture of Neil ruminating about his genealogy. Here he is at the beginning of the story with his happy family before he knows about his genealogy. Here he is with his wife snooping into their African-American maid's room when she's off, and she comes in by surprise and is not very happy. Here's Neil's father telling Neil about a rumor that the Kingsbloods have a royal ancestor. And so Neil goes down to the Minnesota Historical Society archive, and there he discovers that he's 132nd African-American. So he wants to find out what this means. He goes to African-American church services here. He makes friends with a middle-class African-American family there. And he makes friends with Sophie Concord here. She's a Black woman, professional. She's a nurse. She's young. She's very good looking, and she's outspoken and intelligent. And she seems to be willing to show Neil around the Black community. So here she takes him to the Chicken Shack, a Black restaurant. And then here is Neil standing up in front of his exclusive private club, telling his friends that he's partly Black. And then things fall apart. He loses his job at the bank here. His daughter comes out home crying here because she's been taunted on the playground. And here he is with a friend here, armed in his house, because the night before a mob had shown up to intimidate him, to try to move out, to get him to move out of the neighborhood. And he and his friends are here armed because they're afraid the mob might come back. Well, a source for this last scene is something that happened in real life. And that's this. This same kind of experience happened to this physician, Dr. Ashen Sweet. He and his wife bought a house in a white neighborhood in Detroit in 1925. Shortly after they moved in, a mob showed up in front of their house. The next night, he brought his friends together there because he was afraid the mob might come back, and he was afraid of what they might do. And the mob did come back. The people inside the house were armed. The mob threw stones through his windows and broke the windows. And so the people in the house fired their guns. One person was wounded in a leg and another person was killed. So the police came and arrested Dr. Sweet and his friends. Here's the house where this happened. The NAACP supported Dr. Sweet and hired Clarence Darrow to be the defense attorney. The first trial ended with a hung jury. This was a trial for murder, ended with a hung jury. And the second trial, Dr. Sweet was acquitted, and then the charges were dropped against all his friends. But of course, the Sweets went through a horrible ordeal here because such a process like this is drawn out a long way, and it's a horrible thing to happen. Even more sad than this is this story here that you might not know about if you're not from Duluth. This is a story about a lynching. In 1920, a circus came to Duluth, and it had several African-American workers. One night, a young white woman from West Duluth claimed, well, actually her boyfriend claimed first, that she'd been raped by several of these Black men, maybe as many as 6. The boyfriend made the claim, and then she went along with it. The police came and interviewed several workers and took several to jail in downtown Duluth. In the morning after the event, a doctor examined the young woman, and he ended up with questions about whether or not there had been a rape, but the police didn't know that when they took the men to jail. Word got around town about these men being in jail, and a mob began to form in front of the city hall. And by evening, it numbered at least 1,000 and maybe several thousands. Eventually, the mob stormed the jail, broke into it, dragged 3 young men a block up the street and lynched them, a block up the hill, and lynched them at a light post. It's one of the saddest things that's ever happened in Duluth. This memorial was put up in 2003, right on the site of the lynching. Although I've never seen any archival proof, I'm sure that Lewis knew about this. Lewis was known to frequent the County Historical Society Library, which was only about 4 blocks from his house in the 1940s. He researched all his books very well, and the Historical Society archive would have had plenty of the old newspapers that covered this event. So Lewis must have known it, but we don't see any, it's not replicated in the novel like the story of Dr. Ocean Sweet. On the more positive side, here's another source for the novel, Marjorie Kelly. Here she is graduating from high school in 1941, and here she is graduating from St. Mary's 3-year nursing diploma program in 1947. During my long years teaching at the College of St. Scholastica up the hill, I knew a nun once who's now long gone, who told me that she remembered Marjorie Kelly during her nursing student days. And the nun said that Marjorie Kelly was beautiful and intelligent and outspoken. So I'm sure she was a superb informant for Sinclair Lewis. He made friends with her and later corresponded with her after he moved away from town. She's almost certainly a prototype, as much as you can have a prototype for Sophie Concord. Although, of course, you know, fictional characters are always a little different than the prototypes they may be partly based on. She went on to have a distinguished career in Duluth. She became Duluth's first African-American operating room nurse and Duluth's first African-American nurse anesthetist. And these days, one of the elementary schools in town is named after her. Her married name was Wilkins, and so she's the Wilkins being commemorated here. Here's something I must tell you about because I didn't know about it when I first read King's Blood Royal. I thought that Lewis might have been ahead of his time in the way he dealt with race in this book, but turns out that there were many novels about race in the 1940s. Here's a list, and here's a list of books of nonfiction that are about race in the 1940s. And the explanation, I suppose, is maybe obvious, although I hadn't seen it before myself. But when Americans were fighting the Nazis, they were forced to come to grips with the fact that the Nazis, after all, believed in the horrible idea of racial superiority. And so that forced Americans to come to grips with the fact that 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 same horrible idea underlay their society back home. The reviews of the book, as you may know, in the African-American press were just about all positive. In the Northern white press, the reviews liked the cause, but some reviewers, like this New York Times reviewer, thought that Lewis was driving points with a sledgehammer and was heavy-handed. The one very noteworthy Black reviewer who didn't like it is James Baldwin. Here he is writing an essay in commentary in which he reviews 5 novels with race as a theme, and he doesn't like any of them. To give you a sense of the tenor of his remarks, here are some quotes. With King's Blood Royal, we descend abruptly into a kind of lugubrious, sentimental nightmare. This is an ill-tempered, tasteless, condescending novel. And in this quote, he says that the books together kind of inspire you to think that there are some admirable Black people, but then Baldwin says many of them, most of the best of them, are not much darker than you are. And this is, in fact, Baldwin's main complaint, is that there's too much whiteness in these novels. So he says, these novels have in common the assumption that whiteness is a kind of salvation and that Blackness is a kind of death. I can elaborate further on what Baldwin says. He thought the writing in King's Blood Royal was shoddy, that Lewis had exploited the race issue to get attention to the book and then didn't really add any new insight. And worst of all, Baldwin thought that in emphasizing and exaggerating the old 1-drop rule, after all, Neil Kingsblood is only 1/32nd African-American. So Baldwin thought that in emphasizing the 1-drop rule, Lewis had really reinforced instead of diminishing the old racist principle that Black blood corrupts and degrades. Baldwin really didn't like this book or any of these books. Well, on the positive side, we have an article by Jennifer Delton from 2003 in American Literary History. And she thinks that Lewis went through a kind of discovery process while writing this book, somewhat like Neil Kingsblood himself. So she says about Neil here, what Neil first discovers upon becoming Black is not Blackness, but his own horrible whiteness. Delton thinks that Lewis put together the idea of whiteness as a bunch of qualities that he had been critiquing all his life: crass materialism, conformism, narrow-mindedness, hypocrisy, all these things that you find in Babbitry. So she says that for Lewis, whiteness was Babbitry. And yet she thinks that Lewis saw, in the way he put together the book and the trajectory of Neil's experience here, Lewis saw grounds for hope. After all, Lewis has Neil say to himself, I think God turned me Black to save my soul, as if redemption were possible. And Delton thinks that Lewis's idea overall suggested that there is some kind of hope for America in the idea of white people giving up the qualities of their whiteness and sharing in Black suffering. And so here we have in this quote here, through the crucible of Blackness, white Americans could make themselves human again and perhaps redeem the lost promise of democracy. Delton actually concedes, by the way, that Lewis's interest in racial issues may have been shallow, sincere, but shallow. But she thinks that his commitment to the idea of the sin of whiteness was very firm. And she believed that she thinks that Lewis believed that in giving up all the features of whiteness, including Babbitry and the things that we call white privilege today, white people could somehow help to redeem the promise of America, especially in sharing with African-American pain. We might say that her case is that although Lewis was concerned about social justice for Black people, he was even more concerned about redemption for America and for the American promise. Well, I'm not going to resolve this discussion of King's Blood Royal today. I'll leave that up to you. You should read Jennifer Delton's essay and Baldwin's review and the book itself. I think you've seen enough, though, to see that at the heart of this book is a strong opposition between the horrible facts of racism on the one hand, and on the other hand, a very big dream indeed. Such an opposition, of course, can be found in other books that Lewis wrote, and not just the books from the Duluth period. Sometimes Lewis's protagonists are heroes struggling for the good against forces that resisted. Think of Martin Arrowsmith struggling against abuses in American medicine and medical research. Think about Ann Vickers contending with abuses in America's prison system. Sometimes Lewis's protagonists are satirical figures who embody everything that's wrong. Think about Babbitt or Elmer Gantry or Gideon Planish. But even in these cases, the measure of these men's shortcomings is always clear in the implied ideal of what they should be instead. And Lewis had other ways of capturing this conflict as well. In Babbitt, for example, the world that Babbitt lives in has a surface kind of perfection. Babbitt is surrounded by gleaming towers and by glossy, shiny gadgets. And we might say that Babbitt's world has a higher sheen to it than any world before his time, and yet we know, and Babbitt knows, that his life is empty. And think about also about Dodsworth, who dreams that he can have an enriched life and an expanded mind through an extended stay in Europe, and yet the main thing he learns there is that his marriage is crumbling and that and then it does fail. So this opposition between hard facts and dreams is pervasive in book after book of Lewis's career. To sum up the Duluth years, we have, on the one hand, Lewis believing that he could have an experience like Henry David Thoreau at Walden Pond on the one hand, as I say, and on the other hand, he found industrial blight in Canal Park. On the one hand, he believed he could sustain a relationship with a very young girlfriend. And on the other hand, he was aware of the unraveling fabric of marriage in America. And if Jennifer Delton is right, King's Blood Royal also shows this conflict. On the one hand, we have the horror of racial hatred, but on the other hand, we have Lewis still thinking about the promise of America, and he may have believed that redemption for this promise is possible. And even if his concept of how this might occur is flawed by elements of racism, still it shows Lewis reaching for an ideal from his position among the bitter facts. I'm going to finish here with another picture. This is a print of that Barnaby Conrad gave me of a painting that Conrad had done of Lewis in 1947. Conrad thought that he was capturing the loneliness in Lewis's eyes. I think there's more than loneliness here. Of course, Lewis is a complicated man, and if you want to know all the complexities, you should read Richard Lingeman's biography that covers them very well. But for right now, I think more than loneliness, what we have here is the disappointment of somebody who for a lifetime has been looking out at a world that is forever undermining its extraordinary promise. Dor Sherry, who worked with Lewis on the screenplay in Hollywood in 1943, later wrote that Lewis had a quote, sad and haunted look on his face. It was there when he laughed or played or worked. It was the look of a man who had lived with a secret pain that he could reveal to no one. Well, unquote. Well, this is the look that we see here. And if Lewis's books are a window into his soul, as they very well must be, then this is the look of someone who for decades has believed more strongly than the rest of us in what American life can be, and yet has seen more starkly than the rest of us what it is. Thank you. Any questions?
Well, I do.
Okay, good.
Dr. Killough, it's nice to see you again. And thank you again for the diaries. It's just a wonderful book. Anybody who hasn't read it is really missing out. I was wondering what your sense or research was involved with an actual Black community in Duluth in the 40s when he was there researching. And one of the reasons I say that is because when I was a reporter in the late 60s, I had to cover the courthouse in the afternoon, which was the lowest of the low, and collect the statistics. And one afternoon, a young Black man was arraigned for some minor crime. And all of a sudden, the courtroom filled up with probably at least 200 Black people, all very well dressed. And I had absolutely no idea that they were there. I never saw them again. And somebody told me that there was an enclave down near Canal Park or in one of those corners off Park Point. So I was just wondering what you think he drew on in Duluth, and if there was a particular connection between the community of Black people, if they were there then even, and his research.
Well, here's what I found out about the Black community in Duluth. I interviewed long ago a history professor at UMD who was a native Duluthian, and he told me that after the lynching in 1920, the population of Black people in Duluth diminished substantially because this was just an impossible town to live in. So the population of Black people was very small after that. The population increased again with the air base. Now, I don't remember exactly when the air base got started, maybe the late 40s or maybe during the war. And so the Air Force brought some Black people here who ended up staying. So by the 60s, there may have been some Air Force people or retired Air Force people who were Black in Duluth. But when I first came to town in 1980, I thought Duluth had a very small Black community. It struck me as small for a northern city. And the explanation was that, well, because of the lynching, people had left. Lewis, of course, did have some sources. He found Marjorie Kelly. He found the maitre d' at the Kitchigami Club, who became a good friend of his, and liked the book. I found a letter at Yale, in the Yale archive, congratulating Lewis on King's Blood Royal, and he praised the book a lot. And I sort of wondered about that letter because Lewis has a similar kind of character in the book called Drexel Greenshaw, who is not portrayed in a very nice way. He's portrayed sort of like an Uncle Tom. And I wondered what this man must have thought about that, but apparently it didn't bother him. So there were some Black people here, but it was a relatively small community except for what the military brought in. And I don't know exactly if there was a special enclave, in a special neighborhood. I'm not aware of that. You may know more about that than I do.
I really don't. I never saw those people again. I don't know where they shopped. I don't even know if they were all from Duluth. They may have come in from somewhere else, but they were clearly there to send a message.
I think there are more today.
Yeah.
I think there are more today.
Duluth was a strange place that way, because when I walked into the paper the first time, I discovered that I was taking the place at night of a young woman who was moved to the day side, promoted, and she was a young Black woman. And I thought that was amazing. And yet, during my time there at 47th, 48th and London Road, there was a serious racial incident, and that was a very good neighborhood. So, it was really a strange place in terms of my experience of race there.
Oh, I think I know about that incident. That was right across the road from where my wife grew up, and it was a Black family moved in the house there, and some of the neighbors took umbrage. They didn't want a Black family there.
Actually, I don't know if that's exactly true. There was someone that painted racial epithets on the house. And as I understood it, he was a sea captain, so he was gone a lot.
Yeah.
And the paper covered it, and then it happened again. And my editor said, we're not going to do this again. It seems to be part of the inspiration. But a very close friend of mine, her mother, went around Lakeside with a petition asking people to sign it to say that we want you here, we want you to stay. So again, you have this kind of dichotomy of experience. And I think
I think a lot of people signed it because my wife's family was appalled by the abuse that the family took,
Yeah.
you know, so they
Well,
were,
there were people in the neighborhoods that were very supportive of that
Yeah.
family.
yeah.
And they were the only Black family, I think, in Lakeside, right?
I don't know. I don't know.
So anyway, thank you.
Okay. Other questions?
George, I have a question. I was really interested in that review that you showed of James Baldwin and his saying that Lewis was focusing on sort of very light-skinned Black people, and so it didn't really count, or it didn't really get to the heart of racial issues. And I had two comments about it. One is that there is a very dark character, Reverend Evan Brewster, who is described as having very dark skin. But on the other hand, Lewis was great friends with Walter White, who apparently did take him around to parties and to various community gatherings and so forth. And Walter White identified very much the same way as Neil Kingsblood did with the 132nd Black blood, so to speak.
And so what's the question?
Oh, so I was just wondering whether you had run into much writing about Walter White.
Oh, well, I did. I used to have a slide of Walter White in my show here. And he knew, he and Lewis met during the 20s. Walter White was a novelist, actually. He was a writer. And because he could pass as a white man, he was able to do investigations of lynchings in the South, you know. And he almost once infiltrated the KKK. But he identified as a Black man, and so did both of his parents. And he was the head of the NAACP during a time when the NAACP, I think, quintupled its membership. I think he died in 1955, and I think he was maybe still head of the NAACP in the country when he died. And it was like, I don't know, I can't remember the numbers. It was like 400 or 500,000 by then, and it had been only 100,000 when he started as the head. And that might have been part of that phenomenon of the 1940s that forced Americans to reckon with racism. And so there was more interest in social justice for Black people starting in the 40s and going into the 50s. Walter White, of course, according to both biographies, I think, of Lewis, opened the files of the NAACP for Lewis to peruse so that he could get background information about the Black situation. And that may be where Lewis found out about the Dr. Ocean Sweet story, or maybe Lewis just remembered it from reading the newspapers.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one.
Okay.
It's kind of a literary cliche that Gopher Prairie defeated Carol Kennicott. In capsulized synopses of the novel, she loses. But George, in your writing, in your intro to the Signet edition of Main Street, and in the more recent essay in Midwestern Miscellany, you don't necessarily think that's the case. And there's evidence in the Minnesota Diary that community life in and around Sauk Center improved. And Lewis asks a question in the diary: did Carol Kennicott help? Could you comment about that and see some kind of hope that's sprung in rural Minnesota 20, 30 years after Main Street was published?
Well, you're right that the diary says that Lewis sees some changes in small town America when he's traveling to Sauk Center. He notices in the 40s, he notices chain stores have changed the retailing situation, and there are a couple other things that change small towns. It's hard to know. It's hard to know what he would say today. You know, small towns have taken a huge hit from small town business has taken a huge hit from chain stores now. You know, the great big box stores have driven a lot of small businesses out of business. And so a lot of small towns in America are just economically very unhealthy. I don't know how to answer your question. The Lewis saw some improvement in the 1940s, perhaps, and he did ask that question: did Carroll Kennicott help? But who knows what he would say today? When I go back to the small town where I graduated from high school, it's in worse shape economically than it ever was before when I was living there in the 1960s, and. And I think the horizons may still seem narrow there if you're a young intellectual who wants to explore the world beyond. But then there were also changes that occurred from 1920 forward. So I can't answer the question definitively. What do you think?
Well, I think he had a certain ambivalence expressed in the diary in June 1942. The driving around Sauk Center indicated some optimism, but there's an entry on June 29th when he is outside of Old Clitheroe, and he's not very happy. He sees what appears to be drooping grasses and a gray sky. And then he muses, and this is one of my favorite quotes from the diary: "This state needs more eccentrics and more Jews."
Yeah.
And it came to pass that Al Franken was elected, and Paul Wellstone, and even on the other side, Norm Coleman. So
Yeah, well,
Yeah, that's true.
yeah.
He might have found some eccentrics in Duluth, though.
How long were you in Duluth?
I was in Duluth for about 2.5 years.
Oh, okay.
And then like Carol, I got married and that was the end of that.
Oh, okay.
But I should add, I should add that I wanted to add anyway, that Canal Park and the area just in West Duluth along the lake was always an eyesore. And yet not long after Lewis left in the late 50s, there began to be a movement toward tourism as a way to bolster the economy.
Yeah.
As I'm sure you know, in West Duluth, people depended on those industrial jobs. And when the steel plant closed, it was absolutely devastating.
Yeah.
To the economy. And it
Yeah.
didn't really pick up again. And Duluth lost a lot of population, and then it picked up with tourism. So I don't know what the situation is now, but there was a reason why that area was industrial, because people depended on it for their livelihoods.
Right. Duluth these days, the biggest employers in Duluth these days are the hospitals and the colleges and universities.
Right.
So this is a college town and a medical town more than it is an industrial town. But there still are some industries going, but it has changed.
Yeah, which I think is good.
Yeah.
I'll ask a question. I'm relatively new to this. I'm Sean, down over in LA. And thanks for the talk. I was going to ask, in relation to this, that Fred had mentioned, I'm working on Leon Feuchtwanger, one of the German exile writers who was based in LA for quite some time, and was going through the letters of Feuchtwanger of Sinclair Lewis when he was visiting LA and Hollywood at that time. And you're talking about the romantic side of Lewis. I was trying to find if he was corresponding at all with Feuchtwanger also in the 40s, and I didn't find any evidence of that. But one thing that really surprised me was there's one moment where he talks about going to dinner with his friend Franz Werfel and how he also met Gustav, and he would have met Gustav Mahler's widow, Alma Mahler-Werfel, and he seemed to get along with them quite well, which just, you know, when you know some of Werfel's work, although also with the, you know, both with Song of Bernadette, but 40 Days of Musa Dog, kind of strong critiques of, you know, discussions of humanity. I was thinking that was just a side that I'm just trying to imagine them talking together would be with, and your talk helped clarify, you know, those multiple sides a bit more, not just the satirist. Just one other quick comment is in terms of the continuity of Lewis's work, that connection with King's Blood Royal, that I find also there is also more continuity though in his critique of racism in other works, especially It Can't Happen Here, but also before. It's very astute, I'd say, and even one of the most comprehensive in terms of critique of racism in American politics. So that's going on also before, I would say. So yeah. But I wasn't sure if you knew other writers that he might have corresponded with at that time, because the Franz Werfel moment was one thing that surprised me, or other people he would, like you mentioned with Walden, there might have been other people he would have been writing with or exchanging ideas with at that time.
I'm sorry, I'm not aware of any correspondence with those with German writers like that. You know, he knew German. You know, he knew the sort of the popular idiom of the German immigrants in Stearns County, where he grew up, and he'd learned German there. And Dorothy Thompson thought his German was relatively good. She didn't like his accent much, but she thought he was relatively fluent. And if Dorothy Thompson thought that, well, her German was good, so he must have been okay in German.
He has some comment about his time in Minnesota where he says you corresponded with something like Americans who were barely learning it and German immigrants who had forgotten German or something like that.
When he was growing up in Stearns County, of course, there were still German-speaking elementary schools, you know, parochial Catholic German schools, and so there were a lot of people who spoke German around Sauk Center.
I just had a comment. I don't, can you hear me? I can't tell if I'm, yeah, okay. Just what you said about wanting more Jews in Minnesota. And my experience, my grandfather was the youngest in his family, and they lived in Russia. He was born in the United States, in Minneapolis, in the early 1900s, because when the Jews were leaving Russia, his family, an uncle, was the one who came to America first. And where most Jews stopped in New York, his uncle didn't like New York, and he kept going west, and he found Minneapolis and sent for the family. And so as a result, the family moved to Minneapolis at a time when I don't know what Jews were moving to Minneapolis, and my grandfather was born then, the youngest in the family. So it was always very odd that my Jewish grandfather came from Minneapolis. It was just such an oddity for that age. So like I said, I don't know what exactly prompted, but they remained religious. So apparently they found a community there.
There's a pretty healthy Jewish community in Duluth, and has been here for a long time, with community leaders, a very strong Jewish community here, and it goes way back. I don't know about Minneapolis, but I'm guessing that may be true there too. Doesn't fit the stereotype, does it?
Not at all.
Yeah, I think it is true.
Debbie Carter has a question in the chat for you, George.
Okay.
She says, I love the openings to Main Street and Babbitt. Were there any details drawn from his diaries? And I assume by that she means his boyhood diaries, because that would probably be connected with his writing of Main Street.
Are there any details in the openings of those books?
So were there any details? Do you see any connection, say, between his diaries as a young man and the descriptions in Main Street and Babbitt? Oh,
well, I haven't thought about that. I like I've always liked the opening of Main Street. It has a kind of a lyrical quality, because that picture of Carol Kennicott high on the cliff, you know, and over the Mississippi River, you know, she's a beautiful young person, and she's full of hope and vitality. and there's something kind of lovely about her there. So I like that a lot, but I don't know that I see anything like that in the Teenage Diary. Do you see? I don't think I've seen anything like that in the Teenage Diary. Have you?
Not that part. I mean, I think that there's some writings about what the town looked like that makes it into the description of Gopher Prairie, certainly.
Yeah.
But you know, it so much of it. What I find fascinating about Lewis, and I think this is what keeps it really perpetually interesting for me, is the way that he shifts perspective. And so, you know, we see Carol coming into town, and Gopher Prairie looks awful. It's dirty. It's, you know, the streets aren't paved. There's like a bunch of yahoos standing outside the stores, and then, you know, Bee comes to town, who eventually becomes her maid and her friend, and her perspective is just so totally different. Because the town she comes from is only like 100 people, and she says, "Oh, look, there's a movie theater. Isn't this cool? You know, there's actually a hotel in town. This is like a major big deal." And so, you know, I always wonder, when Carol comes to town, she's used to St. Paul, which was, you know, a big city back then, and so to come to this little town of, you know, 1,000 or 2 people, I'm sure it was quite the come down.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's reference in the diaries to a village virus that shows up in the words of Guy Pollock, warning Carol not to be too attached to the town, not to catch the village virus, which will prevent her from going back to a more civilized place. That in a town like Gopher Prairie, people from urban centers languish, and once they catch this village virus. So there's that, and a pledge from young Lewis in the diary to eventually write a book about the village virus that getteth into a man's veins, a good man and true, something. I'm paraphrasing that.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the reasons that Lewis stays so endlessly fascinating, is every time you look at it a little bit differently, there's something else pops out, whether it's the way a character speaks, or whether you're aware of the difference between what the character thinks and what the narrator thinks about a given issue.
One thing that I noticed in King's Blood Royal, while he particularly talks about the middle-class people and the people at the church and all of that, in the very beginning, he has the maid, the young maid, who is rather independent and actually tells him he shouldn't name the dog what he named him, and he changes the dog's name. And then she has these friends who are more of young African-American men who seem to be sort of brash and not like the middle-class people. And yet at the very end, they show up to help defend the house. And I thought that was interesting, that he brought that, even though it was a small group, they were very different from the engineer and the middle-class people and all of that. He showed those people as well, but then showed that they were also supportive in their way. So I thought that was a nice touch. Yeah.
Are there any other questions for George? This group is, I can tell, very passionate about the writings of Lewis.
George, when are you going to write another book?
Oh, well, well, you know, the diary, I just edited that book. I didn't write it. So somebody should publish the Teenage Diary, but it's a huge job. It took me years to do the Minnesota Diary, and it took me years just to identify all the people. And even then, even after I spent years, I hadn't identified everybody. I didn't identify the people that Lewis finds on gravestones. You know, he travels around and goes to cemeteries and then mentions the people on the gravestones. So I couldn't identify them. And there were some people in Minneapolis that I never quite identified, and even some people in Duluth I couldn't. So the Teenage Diary, I could probably identify the people in Sauk Center, but then all the people he meets when he's at Yale, That would be just horrible to try to do that. So I don't think I'll ever get to that.
Yeah.
Somebody should, though, make that available, because that's a more interesting diary than the one that I worked on.
Yours is fascinating to me.
Yeah, you're right. I just love the descriptions. And what I find especially interesting is, since so much of it takes place during the war, that they're just little offhand comments on how the society is changing, and it doesn't make a big deal about it. But he talks about driving through some little town, and women are wearing pants, and he's not sure about women wearing pants. But I thought, okay, well, that's a really interesting detail about how life is changing.
I wonder what Lewis would think of Duluth today.
I wonder.
What do you think?
I wonder. Well, he would, as always, he would run into some hard facts, but he would like the scenery, from Skyline Drive. The scenery from Skyline Drive is still gorgeous.
Yep, it is. Beautiful.
Yeah.
You kind of get hooked on it when you live there.
Yeah. At the time he was here, some of the old, the moguls that had, or at least the children of the moguls who had developed northern Minnesota and had a lot of money, they were still around, and he was living in a neighborhood where there were a whole lot of other great big houses with people in them that were very wealthy, and that society is all gone. Those people, they're just not here anymore. The houses are still there, but there aren't 100 millionaires or billionaires, anymore the way there used to be.
Yeah,
So Duluth is a little different.
Yeah, it's a place of extremes. I mean, extreme wealth, and then the West Duluth, and the Great Divide along Lake Avenue between the two areas. And the weather was very extreme.
Yeah, and the weather is warmer these days.
Yes, I know.
Yeah.
Which I guess is good. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I liked it the way it was before.
Well, thank you so much, George. This has been a wonderful presentation and conversation, and I would love to get my hands on that pictorial essay from Ebony. I was just drooling at that, because I'm aware of it, but I hadn't seen all the pictures, so that was really cool. We will be putting this on the website, so to make it available for our other members, so that they'll be able to enjoy it if they weren't able to tune in today. And the spring newsletter has just come out, so if you haven't received it yet, you should be getting it any day now.
Good.
And I'll be sending along the other on the listserv. So, well, let's just give George a round of applause.
Yay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This has been fun. Thank you very much.
Great.
All
Thanks,
right.
George.
Okay.
Thanks all.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay. Do you have to do anything to stop the recording?